in a dark room, on an evening heavy with the scent of incense. When the Roman soldiers forced open the doors, they were met with a scene. Egypt's legendary queen Cleopatra lay lifeless on the floor, accompanied by her 2 loyal handmaidens. The crown on her head was still carefully adjusted, and this scene meant not only victory for Rome, but also the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition. But how did it come to this? What happened in the process that led Cleopatra, with her intelligence and courage that captivated the world, from her ascension to the throne to her death, said to have been hidden in a basket of figs? In this video, we will recount Cleopatra's final days, that unforgettable story where splendor and tragedy intertwine. Cleopatra was born in Alexandria in 69 BC. Even at a young age, she was recognized for her extraordinary intelligence. She could speak Greek, Egyptian, and even other languages, conversing with foreign envoys in their native tongues. Ancient writers say that her charm lay not only in her beauty, but also in her voice and intelligence. With a soft but authoritative tone of voice, she could influence both philosophers and generals. When she ascended the throne at the age of 18, she was briefly exiled due to palace intrigues. However, when she returned, she had Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most powerful men, by her side. Cleopatra presented herself not only as a queen, but as the earthly reflection of the goddess Isis. She bore Caesar a son, Caesarion. This caused great unrest in Rome, for this child could become a figure who could lay claim to Rome's destiny. Cleopatra's political acumen did not end there. After Julius Caesar, she formed an alliance with Marcus Antonius, but this was not merely a political union. It also turned into a magnificent love story. The pair cast themselves in the roles of gods, becoming legendary in the eyes of the people. Cleopatra took on the role of Isis, while Antony assumed the role of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. Lavish scenes were staged at feasts held on gold-adorned ships on the Nile River, effectively defying the Roman Senate. But behind this splendor lay a dangerous truth. Rumors about Cleopatra spread rapidly throughout Rome. She was said to be a sorceress, a seductress of the East who used perfumes and potions to ensnare men. Octavianus, the rising Roman leader, who would later take the title Augustus, skillfully exploited this propaganda. In the eyes of the Roman people, Cleopatra became a foreign threat who corrupted Rome's virtuous values. In 31 BC, the great battle that changed the course of everything began, the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra's magnificent fleet, consisting of ships adorned with purple sails and silver-embellished hulls, was helpless against the strategies of Agrippa, Octavian's commander. Antony's soldiers had been weakened by hunger and disease. At the most critical moment, Cleopatra ordered her fleet to retreat, and Antony followed her. This decision shattered the morale of the soldiers, and the battle ended in a decisive defeat. From that moment on, the fate of Cleopatra and Antony was sealed. They had neither allies nor hope left. When they returned to Alexandria, even the people lived in fear under Rome's shadow. Though Cleopatra still appeared like a goddess, she was merely buying time, and this time would be used to stage her final grand play. After the defeat at Actium, the fate of Cleopatra and Antony was almost sealed. Nevertheless, Cleopatra was a ruler who never gave up. When she returned to Alexandria, she still tried to appear as a magnificent queen. She continued to gather philosophers, astrologers, and mercenaries in her palace. On the one hand, she planned to divide Roman territory among her children with Antony, while on the other, she tried to present herself as the earthly reflection of Isis. However, the reality was much more dire. She no longer had the power to resist Rome. In Rome, Octavianus was intensifying his propaganda war. He portrayed Cleopatra as the enchantress queen of the East and presented Antony as a puppet captivated by her charms. In the eyes of the public, these two figures had become symbols of lust and extravagance against Roman virtue. This propaganda was so effective that Antony's former allies defected one by one to Octavianus' side. Cleopatra sought a solution and another plan for a time. She considered building a new fleet that could sail beyond the Nile to the Red Sea. She even attempted to transport the ships overland to the Red Sea. This would allow her to cut off Rome's eastern trade routes and, if necessary, even travel as far as India to establish a new center of power. However, this bold plan was cut short by an attack from Arab cavalry. The workers were killed, and the ships were set ablaze. This was one of Cleopatra's final strategic moves, and it ended in failure. The days in Alexandria were becoming increasingly tense. Antony had moved away from his former glorious identity as a general, and had become gloomy. According to Plutarch, the bad news that arrived no longer upset him. It was as if he had given up and accepted his fate. The couple held lavish banquets every evening, as if celebrating their last days. They showered their guests with gold and precious stones, but in reality, these banquets were overshadowed by the approaching end. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's armies reached the borders of Egypt. Antony, in desperation, decided to make one last move. He marched out of Alexandria and clashed with Octavian's army. At the same time, Cleopatra also sailed her fleet out of the harbor. However, before everyone's eyes, Cleopatra's fleet surrendered, almost without a fight. When Antony's soldiers witnessed this scene, they panicked. The cavalry fled, and the infantry scattered. Antony, overcome with anger and disappointment, withdrew from the battlefield. Antonius's morale had completely collapsed. When he returned to the palace, he believed that Cleopatra had betrayed him. Just then, the news brought to him turned his life upside down. Cleopatra was dead. Of course, this was not true. The queen had merely withdrawn to the mausoleum she had prepared in advance for her own safety. But Antonius believed that the woman he loved was dead. "Oh, Cleopatra," he said, "I do not grieve that I have lost you, for I shall join you shortly. But I grieve that I, such a great commander, have been outdone in courage by a woman." So Antony drew his sword and wounded himself. But despite aiming for his heart, he wounded himself in the stomach. Writhing in pain, he begged his servants to take him to Cleopatra. From this point on, the tragedy would unfold one of its bloodiest and most dramatic scenes. Antonius lay wounded in the palace, his eyes still searching for Cleopatra. Finally, his servants managed to pull him up with ropes to the balcony on the second floor of the monumental tomb where Cleopatra had taken refuge. According to ancient writers, this scene was an indescribable tragedy. Antony, covered in blood, stretched out his arms as if reaching for the sky, and rose toward Cleopatra, while the queen, in tears, tried to pull him up. Antony ultimately breathed his last in Cleopatra's arms. He was now a traitor in the eyes of Rome, but to Cleopatra, he was still a king. The queen had lost her lover, but she refused to surrender. She used her tomb like a fortress. She moved her treasures inside and filled the area with materials that could easily catch fire. "If Rome takes my treasures, it will find nothing but ashes," she said. But Octavian was patient enough to foil this plan. When he entered the city, he tried to negotiate with Cleopatra. He wanted to capture her alive and display his victory in Rome in a spectacular manner. Cleopatra, however, was determined to negotiate. She declared she was prepared to sacrifice her fortune to save her children's lives. She even handed over part of her treasures to Octavian's agents. Yet deep down, she knew Rome would not pardon her, for Cleopatra was not merely a queen. She was regarded as one of Rome's greatest enemies. The days passed like this. The queen was fasting, preparing herself according to the rituals of the goddess Isis. The Romans wrote that she had grown thin and pale, but for the Egyptian priests, this was a way to draw closer to the gods, a kind of sacred preparation. Cleopatra was now in the shadow of death, but she was also a queen who would appear before the gods. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra made her final decision. She bathed, put on her royal robes, and perfumed herself. She sat on her throne, accompanied by her handmaidens, Charmian, and Iris. According to some accounts, she had a basket of figs brought into her room, inside which was a snake, the sacred asp. Others say she killed herself with poison hidden in her hairpin. Perhaps we will never know. But one thing was certain: Cleopatra had chosen her own end. When the Romans entered the room, they found a scene that was both captivating and terrifying. The queen lay dead on her throne. Her ladies-in-waiting sprawled lifeless on the floor beside her. It is said that Charmian breathed her last while adjusting her queen's crown. "I did what befits my queen," she is reported to have said, before collapsing to the floor. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was no longer a mortal woman, but the legend itself. Her death was a great victory for Octavian. Now Rome could control Egypt's riches, but it was also a loss. For Octavian's greatest desire was to parade Cleopatra through the streets of Rome in chains. The queen had rejected this humiliation by choosing her own death. Thus, rather than submitting to Rome, she had created her own stage. Cleopatra's death was not merely the tragedy of a woman, but the end of a 3,000-year-old pharaonic tradition. With her, the independent Egyptian state also faded into history. Rome was now the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean. Over the centuries, Cleopatra has been remembered in different ways: as a dangerous sorceress to the Romans, as the earthly reflection of the goddess Isis to the Egyptians, and as the last great queen who fought with her intelligence against impossible odds to modern historians. And perhaps for this reason, Cleopatra's story never ended. Her tomb has still not been found, but her name has become immortal, because sometimes a person's death pales in comparison to the legend they leave behind. The centuries following Cleopatra's death transformed her from a mere historical figure into a legend. Roman poets sometimes described her as a dangerous seductress, other times as a noble enemy. Medieval Arab historians, however, portrayed her as a wise ruler, a philosopher interested in science and magic. During the Renaissance, Shakespeare turned her story into one of the most unforgettable scenes of love and tragedy. 19th-century painters immortalized Cleopatra in dramatic paintings adorned with snakes. Today, historians emphasize her intelligence, political maneuvers, and struggle against impossible odds rather than her captivating charm. Although Cleopatra's tomb remains lost, her name and story live on. Because some people do not write history, they become history itself. And Cleopatra, even in death, continues to live on in humanity's collective memory as a legend who defied Rome and transcended the ages.